All right, welcome everyone. I'm Geoff Hammerson, and we're at the Valley View Forest in Chimacum today for a little walk and talk about forest ecology and what makes a healthy forest, what makes a resilient forest. And we've got some trails that we can take here. If you look at the entrance sign here, informational stuff, there's a nice trail map and field guide that we can use. And we'll get started right away here and head up the trail. And we'll talk about several aspects of this forest in particular, but in general, how we would um, look at a forest to determine whether we think it's in a healthy condition and whether it has the resilience to adapt to change that we might be expecting. So let's go on up the trail and take a look. Okay, one aspect of forest health is the species that are present. Um, we would like to see a forest with different kinds of native species, trees, shrubs, undergrowth, and we would like to see an absence or an insignificance of some of the non-native invasive species that can cause some stewardship problems and ecological problems on the site. But we'll look around here, and this is very nice. We've got lots of western red cedar scattered around, big trees, smaller trees. There's Douglas fir on the other side of the trail over here, and next to it are some western hemlocks. Close to me over here, there's several big leaf maples, a deciduous tree that lost most of its leaves already. On the ground, it's just littered with beautiful golden leaves of big leaf maple. We've got some red alder, another deciduous tree. So a good representation of native species of trees that you would expect to see on a site like this on the lower slope of Chimacum Ridge is where we are really. Um, and as we walk along here, we'll be looking to see if there are any non-native invasive species that um, we would like not to see in a healthy forest. And right here, I don't see any. And maybe as we go along, we'll check in again to see if we've found any. But right now, it looks good. Perhaps invasive holly plants would be something that invades some of the forests in this region, but I don't see any of those here, so that's good. Um, anyway, that forest composition of a healthy um, diversity of native species um, and the insignificance of the invasive ones. And we're looking really good here. So another aspect of forest ecology is not only the species that are present, but also the structure of the vegetation. Is it like a plantation where all the trees are the same age and they're widely spaced and maybe growing vigorously, but it's a very uniform looking um, condition? That's actually a very depauperate kind of forest. What we'd like to see is more diversity in the sizes of the trees, the ages, um, having an undergrowth layer, having some dead wood standing, some logs on the ground, things like that. So we look around here, we've got some, here's a little opening. It's got some young trees in it, some young western red cedars there, and some salmonberry there, some red elderberry. We've got some deciduous trees that are very branchy. We've got some big conifers, like this is a big western red cedar here that's one main trunk that goes way up. Um, we have an old decrepit snag here, a dead standing tree that's just about ready to fall over, but it's been uh, probed into by woodpeckers. So we've got a good diversity of structure here, and that is important for wildlife because it provides opportunities for different kinds of birds, for example, that prefer um, like shrubbery versus tall conifers, or some of them love to forage. Some of our songbirds love to forage in among the deciduous foliage that grows up in the forest canopy, where others like to be up in the evergreen foliage. So we've got a great diversity of structure here. We look around here, maybe not close by. We don't have very many logs on the ground here, but that's another component. Forests, as they age, the trees fall over after they die or get blown over in a windstorm, and that provides even more habitat. Here we've got a lot of sword fern in the understory, um, but here and there, scattered around, there are other things that add complexity to the vegetation and opportunities. You might have Pacific wrens living and foraging among these sword ferns, one of their important and favorite foraging habitats, looking for insects. And then when the salmonberry has fruits on it, you'll have some of the songbirds feeding on those, and they're attracted to a different component. So the diverse structure of the forest is important as well as the diverse species makeup. So we're on a slope here in the Valley View Forest, and we're looking around to see what evidence of ecological processes that might be involved in generating some of the diversity you might find in a forest. Disturbances, as you will, if you will. And here, for example, we've got a tree that's been blown over and is just lying on the ground, so it serves that function we talked about earlier about logs on the ground. But it also creates an opening. Here's another one. Standing, looks like a western hemlock, broken off at the top, probably a windstorm, maybe the same windstorm that broke that one, knocked this one over. And in any event, it's created a little opening here, a little extra light, and has provided a different kind of habitat than in our adjacent forest that is heavily shaded by mature trees with a continuous canopy, leafy canopy over the top, so it's very shady underneath. So you might think of a windstorm, oh, it's caused this damage in the forest, but it's actually a very important part of forest ecology and generating the diverse conditions that allow different kinds of organisms to thrive. And here we've had a bit of disturbance, but as you can see, it's still quite a nice forest here. And over time, other species may be able to move into this area, although in some of these areas that have sword fern in such densities as we see here, it becomes difficult for, let's say, some of the shrubs to become established because of the dense shade and dense root networks of the ferns. But the cavities that form in snags like this, this will be attractive to woodpeckers and all the small cavity nesting birds that depend on the holes made by woodpeckers. They're quite important to a forest as well. Stopped along the trail here just to take a look at a couple of the representative tree species that you can identify fairly easily just by looking at the bark. On my left is a Douglas fir, and this one is maybe 14, 16 inches in diameter, and it shows very deep grooves in the bark that are characteristic of Douglas fir in relation to one of its common associates, western hemlock, which is another large tree that grows in the same forest but doesn't develop those deep grooves. At most it might be slightly furrowed, maybe a little more than this sometimes, but relatively smooth looking and finely grooved compared to the deep, wide grooves in the Douglas fir. I also wanted to mention things on the ground. We mentioned logs earlier. Here's a chunk of bark that has fallen off of one of the trees, and it provides cover for small animals. And we don't really want to have a forest floor that's devoid of this kind of thing. So this woody debris that is lying on the ground is important as a habitat. Didn't see anything remarkable under this one, but if you were to come here during a warmer period of the year or when it's wetter, it's kind of dry right now actually, you might find a salamander under there, or perhaps one of those yellow spotted millipedes, or other kinds of small wildlife that depend on cover like this. So these are fun things to look under, but they are important habitats, as I mentioned, so you want to make sure that if you're looking under logs or rocks or wood, try to put them back exactly the way they were so that little microhabitat stays intact. You don't want to rip it apart and just toss it aside, because those conditions under there take a long time to develop. So try to get it back pretty much the way you found it. Oh, you've moved down the trail a bit and come to an area bordering looks like a seasonal stream down in the distance there. You not, might not be able to actually see it, but bordering it are a lot of tall deciduous trees like big leaf maple right here, and also next to it are red alders. And since most of them have lost their leaves at this point, you look up there, you can still see some of the foliage up there, but there's a big, big light gap. So a tremendous amount of light coming to the forest floor here compared to just opposite us, where the cedars and hemlocks and Douglas firs are crowded in there very densely. So again, the diversity here creates different kinds of wildlife habitats, and also plant habitats. You find different kinds of things thriving in a sunny area, like some of the fruiting shrubs like salmonberry. There's some down there. You'll see those in these openings, but if you look back up underneath the canopy where the evergreens are, and it's much shadier, the understory is a lot more sparse with fruiting shrubs, for example. So a different kind of habitat, even though they're very close to each other. All right. We are in the Valley View Forest, but we're very close to the boundary of another parcel that the Land Trust refers to as the Chimacum Ridge uh, property or project. It's an ongoing project of more than 800 acres of forested land and diverse wetland habitats that are just up this slope here. And the boundary between the Valley View Forest here and the Chimacum Ridge property is just over there on that slope. And that brings up the point of uh, size and landscape context as being important things about forest health and resilience. For example, this parcel, the Valley View, is 65 acres. If it were just 65 acres in the middle of urban development, that would be one thing, but its presence next to several hundred acres of forest habitat makes this property even more um, resilient and valuable, because the populations that are here can interact with those in the greater forest area that extends next to it. That's a really important thing. So events that may cause damage to to aspects of this forest and require revegetation of plants or recolonization by animals. That's so much easier if you have continuity or connectivity or corridors connecting forest parcels. Here it's very excellent setup because the two preserves abut one another and there will be no gap once that whole project is done. They will complement each other and become each one more valuable as a result of being next to the other one rather than being isolated. So a really great project to put these two pieces together. I was talking about logs on the ground, and here's a small one. It's a dead tree that blew over probably in a windstorm, and it might have been so decayed that it didn't take much wind, but here it is on the ground, in contact with the ground, and it serves lots of functions. It's might look a little messy to have all these logs on the ground and scattered around, but they're really important to the forest health because they provide habitats for things that need cover and moisture. For example, little salamanders live under these and make this their habitat. Shrews, red-backed voles love to um, scurry along these logs underneath and beside them. And the logs also hold moisture in dry spells, so some of the invertebrates that need that moisture can have a refuge during the summer dry spells. And it also helps the water that falls during rainstorms slows down the flow and avoids situations where you might have erosion if there was no cover. The leaf litter does that too, obviously. It's great at holding the moisture and then releasing it more slowly into the watershed. Oh, cool. We've found a Douglas fir that has been extensively fed on by pileated woodpeckers. And you can see what they've done here. On this side there are some deep excavations, but if you move over to this side a little bit, they're gigantic. This excavation is like 7 feet long and a foot wide. And here's another one that goes very deeply in toward the heart of the tree. And what the woodpeckers are going for here are carpenter ants and sometimes beetle larvae. I've seen them take both. This is a carpenter ant colony. Well, it's not here anymore, but it was inside this tree, and the woodpeckers detected it and went in there and fed extensively on that colony and probably wiped it out. But a very important feeding habitat for these big, beautiful woodpeckers, and depending on standing dead trees. So this tree is broken off at the top, died during its decay. It was invaded by the carpenter ants and other insects that attract the woodpeckers, and they've done a lot of feeding on this. Probably done now with this tree, but you can see by the extensive excavations that it was providing quite a bit of food at one point. I've seen pileated woodpeckers do the same thing with decadent dying red alder trees that get often beetle grubs out of those that are about that long, big fat things that make a good reward for all the work that goes into these excavations. Like most forests in Washington, this area has been logged in the past, and you can see evidence of it scattered around by these stumps that are here up on the slope all around, but it's a resilient landscape and has become reforested in a very beautiful way. But even those disturbances like logging, or it doesn't have to necessarily be a logging project to cause stumps. Sometimes the trees get blown over, but they create opportunities. So here we have some red huckleberry that has been rooted on top of this stump here and is growing down through the center of the stump and eventually might reach the ground with its root system. But nevertheless, right now it's a pretty large plant and is thriving in a habitat that, when it became established, probably it was just a bare stump here, no other roots to compete with, lots of moisture in the rotting wood here, nutrients, so a great spot for it to get started. How did it get here? Probably a bird ate huckleberry fruit somewhere. Who knows? Could be anywhere that a bird could fly in an hour. It could be many miles from here, and landed on this stump and either defecated or regurgitated the seeds from its meal, and that huckleberry seed germinated here and gave us this. All right, we're out here in the rain shower in the Valley View Forest, and we've been pointing out the beautiful native forest that's here in very good shape, very complex forest with lots of different kinds of habitats within it and microhabitats on the ground and in the trees. And its favorable context in the landscape being connected very tightly with Chimacum Ridge off in this direction. And one consideration that we want to always keep in mind too is the use of the property and the stewardship of the property. And here it's pretty much a matter of avoiding things that might cause soil erosion or excess damage to plant life or disturbance of wildlife behavior. And by having a system of foot trails through the property, that's pretty much allows people to appreciate and enjoy the forest in a very undamaging way. We've got pretty much that addressed here. We're not going to have motor vehicles tearing up the hillside here and causing erosion problems, or scaring off all of the wildlife with that kind of activity. So the question here is, how do we proceed with a forest like this to keep it in a healthy, resilient condition, and as something that engages the community in other ways as well. And I think the future episodes of this series will be talking about some of those things and what the plans are for maintaining this in its present and future condition. One thing we have to remember is that things are always changing. There could be events that occur that cause changes here, and over the long term, climate change is one of those. How do we adapt to those things? How do we think about that? How do we make this a resource in other ways? So, as I said, in the future, some of the discussions in this series will be talking about those things. All right, we've come to the end of our hike in the Valley View Forest, and just to sum up things, we look around and we see a beautiful forest with lots of native species that we would expect to see on a site like this. No impact of invasive plants. We've got natural processes going on here, natural disturbances, trees fallen onto the ground, snags standing here. We've got trees broken off and providing different kinds of habitats for animals. We've got a big forest here that's adjacent to an even bigger forest, which makes its resilience much better. And we've got the land trust acting as stewards for this property and guaranteeing that for forever this will be taken care of and function as a beautiful, valuable resource for the community.